Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research with tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week we continue our trip through Hunt's Romances of the West of England, which is a series of Cornish folklore that eventually will be collected into a gazetteer for Ars Magica. During this concentration on Cornish material, I'm trying to focus on folklore that can easily be turned into story hooks, and the problem with Hunt's chapter on saints is that there's not a lot of useful material. So for the first time in the podcast, we'll be doing 2 chapters for this week. Some things to consider when setting stories in Cornwall. Cornish saints are literally giants. There are several sets of stones that were physically thrown by saints, and the saints are described as being completely titanic. St. Just steals a chalice from St. Kenya, and when the wrong saint flings boulders, it creates the monoliths now known as the Krauser stones. When St. Senan and St. Just get annoyed and throw stones at each other, God, in his wisdom, preserves their lives by making the stones strike together in the air and fall from the sky, and again, this sets up some monoliths. The saints are petty. St. Leven is wandering down to his local fishing hole to catch dinner on a Sunday, and a peasant woman upbraids him, saying he shouldn't work on a Sunday, but she's working in her garden picking herbs, and her name is Johanna. So St. Leven says, "You're an idiot, and any other child named Joanna who is baptized in my parish will also be an idiot." So anyone wanting to give their child that name has to nip next door to St. Senan's. There are a couple of other of St. Leven's miracles floating around in 1220. The path from his house to his favourite fishing spot is greener than the surrounding land, and the rock that he sat upon to fish has a crack in it. That's there because the saint punched it and then prophesied that when a horse with panniers could walk through the crack, the world would be over. St. Leven also once had 2 fish miraculously strike his hook at the same time, not just once because he threw both fish back so as not to show partiality, but 3 times in succession, and this was God's way of warning him he had guests at home. Strangely, the bones from the fish caught in the throats of the children who had dinner with him, so in Cornish they now call them choke-children, this being one of those God working in mysterious ways kinds of miracles one assumes. St. Brechan was a king of Wales, and he had 28 children, 15 of whom were saints, for whom Cornish parishes are named. The most famous is St. Kenya, who earlier in the podcast, and I won't edit it out, I accidentally named, I meant St. Kayen there, or Kevin. St. Kenya is a different person. Her holy well, as previously mentioned in a separate episode, has the property that when newlyweds drink from it, whoever drinks first will have the power in that domestic relationship. There is a throne on St. Michael's Mount that has the same blessing from the same saint. St. Denis in Cornwall is named for the patron saint of Paris because when he was beheaded, his blood fell from the sky at St. Denis in Cornwall. The bloodstains also reappeared before plagues struck London and for other upcoming calamities. St. Keir floated to Cornwall from Ireland on a lump of stone, which was transformed by God into an impromptu raft. St. Neot was only 16 inches high and seemed to get disciples in an instant, whether animal or human, merely by being so holy and kind of awesome. St. German was sent to Cornwall to defeat the Pelagian heresy, but failed, and when a mob formed to martyr him, his tears became a well, which still exists, and a burning chariot guided by 2 angels whisked him away. As he was being lifted away, he was told to curse his works, which he did. That means that his church is no longer holy. That seems like an excellent site for diabolists to congregate, but there you go. The burn marks of the wheels of the chariot of the angels are still visible in St. German. St. Perrin had done various miracles in Ireland and was about to be put to death. He'd fed the armies of 10 kings for 10 days with just 3 cows. He'd brought his hounds back from the dead, and then he'd raised some fallen warriors, but the kings didn't like this sort of business. They turned against him and sentenced him to death. He was chained to a millstone, which was rolled off a sea cliff, and in a miracle it floated to Cornwall. Perrin is a very important saint in Cornwall because he was baking in an oven he'd made impromptu out of stones, and a line of silver metal dripped from the oven. He discussed it with his friend St. Chudwan. Apologies to any Cornish people who I'm mispronouncing the name of one of their saints from. Children, to quote Hunt, knew the mysteries of the East, and they worked out that one of the black rocks that made up part of the oven was an ore, and how to smelt it properly. They called the Cornish together and explained the nature of the treasure they'd found, and days of feasting followed, and these are the ancestors of the current Saints' Day celebration. The flag of Cornwall, a white cross on black ground, represents the metal and the ore. St Nectan's Cave. Now, I like this as a Covenant site. It's a waterfall and lake near Tintagel. When St Nectan was dying, he dropped his silver bell into the pool, and after his death, 2 sisters came from the east and tidied up all of his effects and his body, and they buried him by diverting the river, draining the cave, interring the saint underneath, and then allowing the river to resume its course. Now, I like that as a Covenant site, because although it makes the cave particularly holy, it stops the man's relics from spreading around and damaging other magical sites in the area. The pair strike me as a potential Covenant. Let's quote some Hunt. The oratory was dismantled, and the 2 ladies, women evidently of high birth, chose it for their dwelling. Their seclusion was perfect. Both appeared to be about the same age, and both were inflexibly taciturn. One was never seen without the other. If they ever left the house, they only left it to walk the more unfrequented parts of the wood. They kept no servant, they never had a visitor, no living soul but themselves ever crossed the door of the cottage. The berries of the wood, a few of the roots which they cultivated, and the snails from the rocks and walls, and fish caught in the stream, served them for food. Curiosity was excited. The mystery which hung round this solitary pair deepened by their obstinate silence, which they observed in everything relating to themselves. The result of this was an anxious endeavour on the part of the superstitious and ignorant peasantry to learn the secret. All was now conjecture, and the imagination commonly filled it with a wild picture. Devils or angels, as the case may be, were seen ministering to the solitary ones. Prying eyes were upon them, but the spies could glean no knowledge. Week, month, year passed by, and ungratified curiosity was dying through want of food, when it was discovered one of the ladies had died. The peasantry went in a body to the chapel. No one forbade their entering it now. There sat a silent mourner, leaning over the placid face of her dead sister. Hers was indeed a silent sorrow, no tear in her eye, no sigh hove her chest, but her face told all of a remediless woe that had fallen on her heart. The dead body was eventually removed, the living sister making no sign, and they left her to her solitude alone. Days passed on. No one heard of, no one probably inquired after the lonely one. At last a wandering child, curious as children are, clambered to the window of the cell and looked in, and there sat the lady, her handkerchief on the floor. One hand hung strangely, as if endeavouring to pick it up, but powerless to do so. The child told its story to the people, who again flocked to the chapel, and they found that one sister had followed the other. The people buried the last with the first, and they left no mark to tell us where, except perhaps a large flat stone which lies in the valley a short distance from the foot of the fall, beneath which, I was told, some great person had been buried. This may be covering their tomb. No trace of the history of these solitary women has ever been discovered. There we end the quote from Hunt. I think perhaps the snails and roots are vis sources harvested and used to create sufficient food that they're entirely self-sufficient. Are they refugees from the lost Covenant of Lyonesse? Also, given the proximity of their deaths, there is the possibility they're twins, of course, but might they not also be a Maga and her familiar able to take human shape? This would explain why they look similar, because familiars and their masters tend over time toward, well, pets look like their owners. Let's put it that way. And familiars tend to die slightly after or slightly before their masters do. Moving on to the Holy Wells chapter. Holy Wells are a kind of dependable miracle embedded in the landscape. Players can use them for their miracles or to get bonuses for the Covenant's environment modifier, since so many of them seem to cure disease. The Well of St Lugdvan. This is the longest story, so I'll put it first. After arriving from Ireland and building a church, this missionary prayed for a holy well to appear to draw people. Time for a bit more Hunt. The holy man prayed on, and then to try the virtues of the water he washed his eyes. They were rendered at once more powerful, so penetrating indeed he was able to see microscopic objects. The saint prayed again, and then he drank the water, and he discovered that his powers of utterance were greatly improved. His tongue formed words with scarcely an effort of will. The saint now prayed that all children baptized in the waters of his well might be protected against the hangman and the hempen cord, and an angel from heaven came down into the water and promised the saint that his prayers should be granted. Not long after this, a good farmer and his wife brought their babe to the saint, that it might derive all the blessings belonging to the well. The priest stood at the baptismal font, the parents, their friends around, and the saint proceeded with the baptismal ceremonial, and at length the time arrived when he took the tender babe in his holy arms and signed the cross over the child. When he sprinkled water on the face, the infant glowed with a divine intelligence. The priest then proceeded with the prayer, but to the astonishment of all, whenever he used the name of Jesus, the child, who had received the miraculous power of speech from the water, pronounced distinctly the name of the devil, much to the consternation of all present. The saint knew that an evil spirit had taken possession of the child and endeavoured to cast him out, but the devil proved stronger than the saint for some time. Lugdven was not to be beaten. He knew the spirit was a restless soul which had been exorcised from Trisau, and he exerted all his energies in prayer. At length the spirit became obedient and left the child. He was now commanded by the saint to take flight to the Red Sea. He rose before the terrified spectators into a gigantic size and spat into the well. He laid hold of the pinnacles of the tower and shook the church till they thought it might fall. The saint alone was unmoved and prayed on until, like a flash of lightning, the demon vanished, taking down a pinnacle in his flight. The demon, by spitting in the water, destroyed the spells of the water upon the eyes and the tongue too, but fortunately it retains its virtue of preventing any child baptized in it from being hanged with a cord of hemp. Upon a cord of silk it is stated to have no power. The peasantry of the neighbouring districts began to send for the renowned water before christenings, and many of them actually continue to, till this day, to bring corked-up bottles to their churches and beg particularly that it be used whenever they present their children to be baptized. That's the end of the quote from Hunt. Redruth's well has similar properties. This saint, Redruth, is known by that name because she always wore a scarlet cloak, which seems odd. I'm tempted to make her a flambeau magus, but we'll see how that goes. Gulval Well predicts death and sickness of absent friends and family members. The querent prays by the well, and if the answer is good, the water bubbles, and if the person is ill, mud bubbles up instead, and if the named person is dead, there is no change to the surface of the well. The Well of St. Kenya has been mentioned a couple of times already in this podcast, but I'll just flag it now. Madden Well has several properties in folklore. People take the water away because it slowly cures bodily infirmities, including in some cases being crippled. Some sources say that you drink the water, others that you bathe in it. It's also handy for lesser problems like colic. Those who dip their hands in are burned if they are untrue in love. There is a minor ritual which involves laying on the ground and offering little things like pins to activate the well. Time for some more Hunt. I once witnessed the whole ceremony performed by a group of beautiful girls who had walked on a May morning from Penzance. 2 pieces of straw about an inch each were crossed and a pin run through them. The cross was dropped in the water and the rising bubbles carefully counted as they marked the number of years which would pass ere the arrival of the happy day. This practice also prevailed amongst visitors to the well at the foot of Monocuttle Grove near St. Austell. On approaching the waters, each visitor expected to throw in a crooked pin, and if you are lucky, you may possibly see other pins rising from the bottom to meet the most recent offering. Rags and votive offerings to the genius of the waters are hung around many of the wells. Mr. Couch says, at Madron Well near Penzance, I observed the custom of hanging rags on the thorns which grew in the enclosure. I've seen similar things in Welsh folklore where they're a sort of charm. You leave them there and then take them away again, and you can use them for domestic magic. The Well at Altar Nun. This is Hunt quoting Carew. The water running from St. Nun's Well fell into a square and enclosed walled plot, which might be filled at what depth they listed. Upon this wall the frantic person was put to stand, his back toward the pool, and from thence, with a sudden blow in the breast, tumbled headlong into the pond, where a strong fellow provided for the nonce took him and tossed him up and down, alongst and athwart the water, till the patient, by foregoing his strength, had somewhat forgot his fury. Then he was conveyed to the church, and certain masses said over him, upon which handling, if his right wits returned, St. Nun had the thanks, but if there appeared small amendment, he was boused again and again, while there remained any hope of life or recovery. The 2nd of March is dedicated to St. Nun, and the influence of the water is greatly exalted on that day. Its position was, until lately, to be discovered by the oak tree matted with ivy, and the thicket of willow and bramble which grew upon the roof. The front of the well is of a pointed form, and has a rude entrance about 4 feet high, spanned with a single square stone, which leads into a grotto with an arched roof. The walls of the interior are draped with luxuriant fronds of spleenwort, hart's tongue, and a rich undercovering of liverwort. At the further end of the floor is a round granite basin, with a deeply moulded brim, and ornamented on its circumference a set of rings, each enclosing a cross or a ball, The water weeps into it from an opening at the back and escapes again by a hole in the bottom. I've quoted those plants because they seem like a vis source. Spleenwort and liverwort are herbs used for treating illnesses of the named organs. Hart's tongue I'm not familiar with. So they could be a corpus vis source. Then again, given the context of the local miracle, they could be a mentum vis source. St. Cuthbert's Well is obviously a vis source. It's sometimes called Holy Well because it was discovered on All Hallows Eve. That's not suspicious at all. Time for some more Carew, quoted in Hunt. The same stands in a dark cavern of the sea cliff rocks beneath full sea mark on spring tides, from the top of which cavern falls down or distills continually drops of water from the white, blue, red, and green veins of those rocks, and accordingly, in the place where those drops of water fall, it swells to a lump of considerable bigness, and there petrifies to the hardness of ice, glass, or freestone, of the several colours aforesaid, according to the nature of those veins of rock from whence it proceeds, and is of a hard, brittle nature, apt to break like glass. The virtues of this water are very great. It is incredible what numbers in summer season frequent this place and waters from counties far distant. That's the end of that quote. Cuthbert's Well is also used to dip children with rickets in the first 3 Wednesdays in May. That may point to a better harvesting time for the viz. The crowd during this process is sometimes so large that there's an impromptu fair. The well at Chapel Uni is similar to Cuthbert's Well, but it's for mesenteric diseases, remembering that Hunt claims that changelings were really children with these sorts of intestinal diseases. Pennon's Well has similar properties again, and on Palm Sunday, the Holy Well at Little Conan tells the future. People pay the priest and throw a cross in, and if it floats, they'll live until the next year. So as you can see, the Holy Wells are free-range magic items used by members of the public, and some of them even grant virtues, like microscopic sight. Time to finish with a bit more from Hunt. It's a very common notion amongst the peasantry that a just retribution overtakes those who wilfully destroy monuments, such as stone circles, crosses, wells, and the like. Mr. Blight writes me, "Whilst in St. Just a few weeks since, an old man told me that a person had altered a holy well there and drowned the next day in sight of his home, and a person who carried away the stones of an ancient chapel had his house burned down that very night." That's the end of the quote from Hunt. If I were a magus, I'd let slip to my enemies a rumour that I had a weakness concealed beneath one of these wells, so they kill themselves when they try moving it. There must be more examples, like building one of the stones into the wall of a convent without moving it, so that when people lay siege to your castle, the curse strikes them down.